everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you a wrap-up of horror and thriller books. These are the books that I read leading up to Halloween. I have some fantastic recommendations for you, a lot of new releases, well, some backlist, and these are books that just gave me the spooky, nostalgic Halloween horror feels, and hopefully you will enjoy these books as much as I did. All that being said, let's get started. First, let's talk about a book that is technically not horror, but is still going to give you all the horror feels, and that is Swashbucklers by Dan Hanks. It's a book that I received from Angry Robot Books, and this is technically more classified as a piece of fantasy, and so I intended to put it in my science fiction fantasy wrap-up, which will be up next week, but when I read it, I realized that I felt like my horror audience are going to be the ones that will love this book as much as I do. And this book is set in a small town where years ago, back in 1989, there was supposedly this gas leak that caused everyone to hallucinate and go crazy and see monsters. And now the story is taking place in the present day, where the children at that time are now adults, and the one is returning back home because another situation has happened that seems very similar. Another death has taken place. And these kids, who of course are now adults, believe that maybe something more was going on. Maybe it wasn't a gas leak. Maybe they're actually monsters. No one else believes them, so they are tasked with fighting the evil of the town once again. Now, from the synopsis, you can probably see why I'm recommending this to my horror fans, because this book is filled with the tropes and setup of a horror story. This definitely gave me vibes of It, Stranger Things, Nosferatu, and just those little like magical stories that are just fantastical, but in a good creepy way. The prologue is amazing. It definitely gave me those vibes of a Stephen King book in the best possible way, and it was just really fun. So the reason I would call this fantasy is that it really isn't scary. I would say that it's written to play into the tropes of, again, the kids fighting the evil, but it's done in more of a fantastical way, more of like almost a portal fantasy, and it's just really fun. I don't know if it does anything I've never seen before, because again, it's making a lot of nods and winks to a lot of the classics out there, but it didn't feel like a ripoff. It felt very fresh and fun, and I just blew through it. I read it in, just probably a day or so, because I couldn't put it down, and I keep wanting to use the word fun because it really was an incredibly entertaining read. And again, if you're looking for something lighthearted, not something that's going to scare you and keep you up all night and disturb you, but if you just love those horror tropes, this is going to give you all the nostalgic feels, and it is making tons of references to like the 80s and the toys and the games of that time period, and I personally loved it, so highly recommend. This is definitely a sleeper new release that you don't want to miss. Next up, we have Pretty Slash Ugly by Jennifer Ann Gordon. This is a book that I received from the author via the publicist, and this follows two perspectives, one being a girl who is a social influencer via Instagram, where she does makeup tutorials and different makeup looks, and then there's another perspective of a male, and within the story, it is technically a horror story, definitely leans on the side of is it horror, is it suspense, and it is this cutting story that involves a lot of themes of fierce femininity. It deals with online personas, the impossible beauty standards of the internet, and just the challenges of putting yourself online. And this is a book that I was offered for review, and when I heard that synopsis and knew what the book was about, I knew it was going to be right up my alley, and it really was. If you follow my channel for a while, you know that I have a love for what I call fierce feminist horror, and this definitely fit the bill. It was so topical and very female-centered, and I thought that the author made some really good social commentary while still writing a biting story. I will be honest that the second perspective of the male, while I appreciate giving this male perspective on these topics, didn't quite hit home the same way, and I found myself much more invested in the social Instagrammer. And a lot of that has to do with the fact is, as myself, as a booktuber, I'm also putting myself online and being held up to online scrutiny. People do comment on my appearance and all of that, and so it definitely hit home to me. But again, if you're looking for an underhyped horror that is very focused on these feminine topics. And again, if those are themes that you also love to read about, this is one you probably want to check out for yourself. I was really impressed by it. Next up, we have The Book of Accidents by Chuck Wendig, which, yes, I finally read that beast of a book that came out earlier this year. And this story is told from multiple perspectives, and it follows a husband who is moving back into his childhood home where he has a very difficult relationship with his father who passed away because he was very abusive. He's moving there with his wife, who is an artist, along with their son. They are moving in order to get a fresh start for their son, who at the beginning of the story was involved in an incident. And now again, they're looking just to move on and move forward as a family. Now, I would describe this as a piece of epic horror because it ties in a lot of highly fantastical elements. The story is very big in scale. You have characters with supernatural powers being introduced, and you find out that there is so much more going on to the story, and things are just a lot bigger than just the family. I don't want to give away too much of the plot because I went into this one quite blind and I really enjoyed the experience. There's a lot of moving parts in this story and a lot of different threads, and I will be honest that I do feel like I need to reread the book in order to assess whether or not the author completely pulled everything together, because there's a lot going on, and while the book was easy enough to follow, I wasn't entirely sure if everything pulled together at the end. I did really like some of the twists and turns. If you know my taste in books, without giving away too much, you'll know why I enjoyed it so much. I really liked where the story went. I thought the ending was generally quite good. Particularly the very ending was very solid for me. It's something that I really like to see in books. And as for the story, I'd say that the biggest strength was the characters, particularly the different points of view of the family. And so I really think that this is a good book if you like those horror stories that are focused around themes of family and love and are very emotionally charged, while at the same time definitely getting a intense story with really big stakes. So this is a book, again, that I call epic horror because I think it's comparable to things like Nosferatu and It, where there is a lot more going on and it's so much more than this small group of people. And I loved, again, the themes that it dealt with. It was very topical in terms of dealing with generational abuse, and so content warnings there, although I felt like the actual abuse was typically just mentioned off screen, and so it wasn't too intense to read, but very thematically important. And I really liked what the author was saying with this book. Again, a lot of moving parts. It's hard to give it a perfect 5-star read just because there was so much going on that I always feel like there's a question of whether or not things could be edited down a little bit more, but overall really enjoyable, and I would definitely recommend it. I do think it's one of the best 2021 releases I've read this year in terms of horror. I also want to briefly mention that I did a reread of Imaginary Friend by Chbosky. I did an individual review of this, so if you want my longer thoughts, you can definitely check that out. But basically, this is a piece of epic horror because that is what I've been in the mood for recently. And this is told over multiple points of view, one being a mother and her young son who are moving to a new town to get a new start. They're struggling. The boy seems to have a learning disability. He goes missing and shows up days later, and he has changed. His disability has gone away and he appears to be highly intelligent. The story also follows other characters, including a highly religious lady. And the story, of course, has these great stakes and these epic conclusions. And I love the story until the end where it all falls apart. There are too many climaxes, too many endings, too many threads that the author is trying to pull together and fails miserably at doing. And the story itself just has way too many religious overtones. I realize the author is trying to do a nice twist on those themes and try to make it fresh and different, but it was just way too on the nose, and I just did not enjoy where the author took the story. So it's a book that I reluctantly recommend because I love the story so much, but it is one of my favorite books with one of my least favorite endings. The ending is so bad, but I love the story despite of it. So I don't even know how to recommend it on my channel anymore, but I just want to mention it here because I did reread it and I'm even more torn rereading it how I feel about it these days. Now, switching gears, I want to talk about a medical thriller called Needlework by Wick Welker. This is a book that I read via the audio thanks to the author. And this follows a man who is a doctor. He works as an anesthesiologist, and within the story, he is trying to help out a friend and ends up getting slapped with a potential charge of malpractice, and the story spirals from there. Now, a few things to know going into this is that this is the same author who wrote Refraction, one of the science fiction books I read and loved earlier this year, so I was eager to check out anything else he wrote, even though this one was not science fiction, but he knows that I also enjoy thrillers, so I eagerly said yes to get to review this. And the other thing that makes this book really cool is the fact that the author himself is a doctor, and so he is able to bring a lot of his own medical experience into the book, although right in the preface of the story he is very clear that this book is not autobiographical. He certainly does not approve or act on any of the things that the main character does in this book. And the main character is an interesting one. He's kind of one of those typical unlikable characters, so he's not detestable by any means, but he makes some poor decisions and he's not always the nicest, greatest guy. And so you're basically watching him in this downward spiral as he is trying to get himself out of the situation and things are going from bad to worse. While this is described as a thriller, I will mention that is more suspenseful and interesting than actually thrilling. There isn't a lot of action in the book. Instead, again, the best parts of the book, in my opinion, were learning about the ins and outs of the American medical system and getting those insights into what it's like to become a doctor, the experience of being a doctor and working in that field. And so I thought those parts were really fascinating. The story itself was interesting. I wouldn't advise you to pick up this book if you're just about to get surgery, if you're at all anxious about medical procedures, but I thought it was, just a fun book. It definitely picked up at the end. And it was just an enjoyable read on something that I didn't know a lot about and just made for kind of a fun, different kind of thriller, something like I haven't read before, which is always what I'm asking for, right? And last, I want to talk about The Apollo Murders by Chris Hadfield. And this is a historical science fiction story that is set during the Apollo mission, specifically when Apollo 18 was going to be launched. And as the title suggests, this is a mystery novel because it follows an astronaut in preparation for the mission and as they go on the mission. And while there are possibly some untimely deaths that might look like murder, the Russians might be involved, and this story involves some puzzling out what actually happened. The story is told over multiple points of view, and I will say that I went to this book with really high expectations because if you're not aware, the author Chris Hadfield is a Canadian astronaut, one that I personally love. He's quite a celebrity over here, and I was very excited when I found out that he was writing a piece of fiction. And again, it's similar to the last book I talked about. It's an author who is bringing in his own experience into the book, so you get a lot of really interesting facts about what it's like to be an astronaut, and I found that to be really interesting. You can definitely tell the author brings in some of his own personal experience. One of the characters brings out a guitar at one point, which if you know the author, it's a good kind of nod and wink to his own personality, but at the same time, it's definitely fiction. I will say, unfortunately, I feel like he is a stronger astronaut than perhaps as an author. I found the characters to be very flat and uninteresting. I just never really got attached to them. There are some attempts at humor in this novel, but I found them to be quite weak and just never really hit the mark. I should mention that I listened to this on audio, which I do think helped my reading experience because it's narrated by Ray Porter, who's one of my favorite narrators. Those of you probably know him as a narrator of Project Hail Mary, and he definitely did a good job with this story, but I feel like he could only do so much to uplift it. So I'll be honest, while I found the individual facts about the astronaut program really interesting, I enjoyed learning about the history of the program, especially tied into some of the nonfiction I've read recently. But as a story itself, I didn't find the mystery engaging. I didn't care who had done it. I didn't really care for the reveals, and I found myself struggling to actually focus and pay attention to the book. Again, not because of the audiobook narration, but just the story itself was not holding my attention. So I've got to say this is probably one of my biggest disappointments of the year, only because I really thought this could be a favorite, and it fell really flat in terms of the actual story. So I hate to say that. So that is it for this video here. I would love to hear down below of the books I talked about, which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? And I would also like you to help me out with a particular project, and that's the fact that I want to read more epic horror. I don't even know if it's an actual subgenre, but just something that I kind of describe as these books that are told in multi points of view, that are quite large, and tell these really big stories with really big stakes. So things like that would be Imaginary Friend, Book of Accidents, It, things like that. that. A lot of Stephen King books I think would fit that bill. So if you have any recommendations for books that you would describe as epic horror, please leave them down in the description box. I'm really looking to read more, and it'd be cool if I could come back maybe with a whole recommendations video on the topic. Otherwise, if you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror and thrillers, not just at Halloween, but all year round, as well as adult science fiction and fantasy. If you want to help me out, you can give this video a thumbs up, you can share it around online, and you can also hit that little notification bell so that you never miss a video from me. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.